Good to have you back for this interview on Africa 24. Mrs. Amany ASFOUR is the president of the Africa Business Council on the sidelines of the 30th Afreximbank annual meetings here in Accra. She'll be talking to us about the challenges faced in establishing a conducive business environment in Africa today and possible solutions. Thank you, Ms. Amany, for answering our questions.
My pleasure.
Thank you for being here with us. So Afreximbank, on the sidelines of its 30th annual meetings, celebrated its 30 years of existence. Can you tell us what you think about the progress towards achieving Africa's trade on the continent?
So actually, Afreximbank, congratulations for Afreximbank on its 30th anniversary. I believe Afrexim has been very instrumental in supporting the private sector. And as you rightly mentioned, the private sector under the Africa Business Council, which is established in line with the Heads of State Decision Summit, to be the voice of the African private sector. Our competitive founding vision is a competitive, borderless, innovative Africa for trade, investment, and industrialization. To pursue this, there is several challenges actually within the whole agenda, how we really realize our Africa 23 development agenda, which is a prosperous, peaceful, integrated Africa. The private sector is crucial for realizing this agenda. So for us, our strategy is really about three pillars. The first pillar is private sector empowerment, and that would include SMEs, women and youth, how we empower the private sector through building its capacity, through information, through incubation, through really training and capacity building. The second pillar is policy advocacy, how the government have a conducive environment for investment, because when the private sector want to invest in a country, they want to make sure that they have return on their investment are secure, that they have incentives for these investments. So the governments really should have this conducive environment, should have legislation also for preferential treatment for African products, because what we are lobbying for also as private sector is to have at least 40% of all government procurement goes to African private sector. Because if we really do this, then we will have a real important shift, and we can at that point make sure that we have a mapping exercise for what's existing on the continent and how we can really support our African products. The third pillar is about product development. So if we have the legislation and we empower our African private sector, we would like to have the product of Africa, made in Africa product which is strong, which is competitive, which is value added, which is standardized. And this is the whole process cannot be done alone. It has to be partnership on a public-private dialogue between the governments and the private sector. We need to see mapping exercise of the existing resources on the continent and how we can add value to these resources. And that's why also Afreximbank is huge importance to see how we finance our trade, but also how we finance our African products to value add on it. And I believe Afrexim really has shown a great importance and have shown a real support to the African private sector. What we really need as the private sector of Africa is how the governments should put those legislations and make preferential treatment for the African private sector. And through this, we have really had several clusters under the Africa Business Council in order to speak to the different sectors. So within those clusters, we have energy, we have trade, we have investment, we have agriculture, agribusiness, we have creative industries, fashion industries, mineral development resources, blue economy, green economy, women entrepreneurs, youth entrepreneurs, SMEs. So in addressing all those clusters, each cluster is chaired by a private sector entity within the continent. And the inclusive membership of the Africa Business Council is the regional economic blocs business councils like COMESA Business Council, SADC Business Councils, the chambers of commerce of East Africa, of West Africa, the chambers of commerce from across the continent, the sectorial organization. And we are trying to see how also with the African Union and with the financial institutions we realize the recommendation of the African Union and the projects, like currently, for instance, there is the CAPS, which is the Common Africa Agro-Industrial Parks, how we can empower the private sector with reference to agro-industry. With the mineral development resources, we're trying now to put some training centers for the gemstones, cutting and polishing our own gemstones. We are trying to set up business incubators and business development centers for the youth entrepreneurs.
Yeah, talking about setting up businesses for the youth entrepreneurs, how is Afreximbank supporting resilience in African economies, supporting youth entrepreneurs to create opportunities for Africans? Can you just tell us how the bank is supporting in this
So
line?
that is the beauty of the bank. How is it supporting all our private sector, including women and youth? So the Afrexim Bank also have a startup program to empower the youth entrepreneurs, and we are currently also trying to see how we engage so that we have the biggest TV program on the continent, which is called Hunting for Africa's Unicorns, and to have Afrexim really a strategic partner with us, because we believe that youth entrepreneurs and the startups are the future of our continent. Having more than 60% of the African population are youth less than 25 years, so empowering the startups of Africa, especially the tech startups, which is about the health tech, the education tech, the fintech, the agriculture tech. We have several of our startups that's huge really ideas, but what we need is how to support them, how to really finance them, how to help them in their patencies, in the intellectual property rights. And I believe Afrexim is really doing a great job with reference to addressing all the sectors within the African continent, and also supporting the women and youth entrepreneurs, even at different sectors like health. There is the Africa actually medical facility that is going to happen to be in Abuja with the high tech, also supporting the private sector in pharmaceuticals. You know, it is very important, this engagement with the financial institution, to see how the financial arm can support the private sector in realizing its progress and in achieving the manufacturing and industrialization, because I believe that industrialization is the crucial for our real economic growth and economic development.
Yeah, so you talked about the aid of financial institutions. How do you view this role that developing financial institutions play in building prosperity for Africans?
Well, prosperity of Africa is really our aim as Africa 2030 development agenda, and financial institutions is very important to finance our projects. But in order to finance our projects, we need bankable projects, and those bankable projects, we need to build the capacity of the private sector to have bankable projects, but also to identify which areas of intervention, like what I mentioned before, is that for us to realize prosperity, and that's our real aim, we have to empower our African people. We have to empower our African private sector. And whatever we are trying to do, if the governments don't give those enabling environment for the private sector to invest, and also to increase our intra-Africa trade. Our intra-Africa trade till now is 16%. How can we increase it? We need to see what is existing on the continent, how can we promote it. Like, for instance, if we talk about pharmaceuticals, in Egypt, for instance, there is 165 pharmaceutical industries, but still we are importing from India and China. What we're trying to do is to really, how can we empower our African private sector so that whatever on the African soil cannot be brought from outside the African soil. And to see how we add value to our products so that we don't export our raw materials and then import it after value addition. It's really about the harnessing the potentials of the raw materials on the continent and empower the manufacturing and the industrialization, and have energy for all of this, because we cannot have industrialization without energy. So we know also that Africa harnessed 45% of the green energy and the renewable energy in the world, whether through solar, through wind, through hydraulics. So renewable energy also is huge, and this is one sector that we are working on as Africa Business Council. And green economy. The role actually of the financial institution is to see how we can support the financing of the private sector to realize our agenda of 2063 development agenda and to realize the Africa Continental Free Trade Area.
So can you explain to us, intra-Africa trade figures still remain very low despite all the energy put in by governments, despite all the energy put in by the Afrexim Bank? The figure still stands very low at 16%. Can you just tell us what is not going right? Is there something the governments are not doing right to be able to operationalize intra-African trade? And are there any recommendations you can make?
So thank you very much. I believe your question is really, the solution of your question will solve all our problems on the continent. So yes, as you rightly say, everybody's talking about the low intra-Africa trade with 16%. How can we increase it? And that's exactly what I was saying, is that we can only increase it when we have a mapping exercise of what's existing on the continent, which products are existing on the continent, and how we make matchmaking programs. If a country is importing pharmaceutical, where is this pharmaceutical done? If it's importing medical consumables and supplies, if it's importing garment and textile, how are we going to make this data available for all our African countries? On another level, we also need to, as I mentioned, add value to the existing raw materials. If we know, for instance, now that in the field of green economy, for instance, electrical batteries for electrical cars, 2030, there will be needed 200 million electrical cars. Who are supplying for them the batteries? We need to have industrialization for the batteries, lithium batteries within the country, because we have the raw materials. So this is another thing that we really need to see how we can industrialize, so we are able to increase our intra-Africa trade. Also, of course, infrastructure. The issue of the high cost of production because of high cost of transport among our countries. So we need to invest in infrastructure in order to have roads, in order to have railways, in order to have shipments through the marine, through aviation. We need to really invest in our networks of roads and railways, so the cost of the product will go down, because this is a huge impediment. Also, ACFTA is about negotiation and non-tariff barriers, how we also standardize our products. So if we register one product in one country, it has to be standardized in all the other countries across the continent, and not registering every product in each country.
All right, so thank you, Ms. Amany ASFOUR, for answering our questions. Thank you for being with us. I recall that you are the president of the Africa Business Council. See you next time.
Thank you very much.
And that was it for this interview. We have more programs coming up on Africa 24.